Well, for about 10 years now, a movement has been underway, the locavore movement, the back to nature movement, the anti-factory farming, anti-industrial farming movement, to create an idyllic farming scene and a notion that we can have eggs and we can have chicken meat and we can have milk and so forth, and beef and whatnot from humanely raised animals. And so there has been a movement now, the backyard chicken keeping movement, the urban farmed animal movement, where people who are subscribing to this idea have succeeded in getting their municipalities to pass laws to enable them to keep hens for eggs, 4 to 6 hens, for example. Almost never are they allowed to keep roosters. And in some cases have been allowed to start slaughtering chickens and goats on their property. And this whole idea that somehow you can humanely raise and slaughter your own animals on your own farm, in your own yard, your own rooftop, or whatever. Well, so there are two basic phenomena here. One is more or less standard farmers who are saying, well, you know, we don't keep our hens in cages. Our hens used for egg production in cages. We raise hens who are cage-free. These are commercial operations. But what we learn when we do undercover investigations of these commercial operations is that cage-free does not mean that chickens are running around out in the grass or out in the fields or roosting in trees. That they are literally not in cages if the farmer is telling the truth, but they are completely confined in long 400, 500 foot long buildings. Most hens used for egg production in cage-free operations have a square foot, maximum square foot and a half of living space per hen. And for example, when I visited a cage-free organic hen operation in Central Virginia 3 years ago, as a result of learning about 25,000 hens who were being allowed to starve to death there. And they were discovered by accident because a humane officer was there to investigate dogs who were said to be malnourished on the property. And they stumbled by accident upon these 25,000 or so hens, cage-free organic hens, who hadn't been fed for 2 weeks and were dying. Well, there's a long story there, but what it comes down to is that these hens, of course, were eventually the Virginia Department of Agriculture got involved, and there were emails back and forth, and we got information through our Freedom of Information Act request and got all these emails and saw how cavalierly they treated the whole situation and joked with each other about depopping the facility, and we were going to we have to have our Christmas holiday, and then we'll ship them down to North Carolina to this processing plant. And so what this brought out was, first of all, and then years later, I actually visited this place. I managed to get and my 2 staff people managed to get a visit to this particular operation called Black Eagle Farm in Central Virginia. And what we saw there was just amazing. The chickens were wall to wall. They were just a sea of chickens. They were brown chickens. They had no room to move. They were cramped in every conceivable way. And as we were explained to by the manager, they were getting ready to be depopped, that is, sent off to slaughter. What we later learned about the chickens who had been there when we visited was how they were killed by a former worker who then left his job and was willing to talk with me and explain how he saw them being killed. And this is one of the standard ways that the so-called cage-free and free-range hens are being killed. They take a couple hundred of them and they put them in metal boxes, and then they shoot cold, freezing cold carbon dioxide into these metal boxes on the farm site. And this freezes the bird's lungs. It's a horrible death. It is not in any way humane. And yet this has become, in one methodology or another, this has become a kind of standard alternative to sending hens in the egg industry, whether they're called cage-free or whatever they're labeled as, an alternative to sending them hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles, even from the US into Canada, to be killed in the what they call the spent fowl plants. So what we're seeing, for example, as black eagle exemplified and has been found in California and in virtually every state where an undercover investigation has been conducted, that the so-called cage-free hens are being kept in extremely crowded conditions. They never go outside, and they are going to be rounded up, and they might go into battery cage operations. They might go to a spent fowl slaughter plant, or they might undergo that horrific gassing procedure that the worker at Black Eagle described to me in detail. He said it was the most horrible, dreadful thing. He said they played baseball with the live hens. They joked about them. They used baseball bats. And again, I'm just citing this as an example of the kinds of things that go on when creatures have when those who own creatures have no accountability and they think no one's looking, and the creatures are completely helpless to defend themselves. Free range means that the birds or the animals, whoever they may be, are supposed to have what's called certified access to the out of doors. But farmers have done everything in collusion in our country, in the US, with the Department of Agriculture, and I'm sure it's the same here in Canada, to use bird flu, for example, as an excuse to never let the birds go outside. To say, well, if a wild bird was flying overhead and dropped a dropping that could contain an avian flu virus, and one of our birds came in contact with that flu virus, that could spread avian influenza in the flock, and so the birds are safer and better off if they're locked up all the time. And so these are the kinds of things that we find when we look into commercial, so-called alternative, non-factory farming, so-called methods of raising animals commercially. What we also find is that the breeding that has been done to create hens who lay 250 or 300 eggs a year, as opposed to, let's say, 2 clutches of 12 eggs per year, as they do in their natural habitat. What has been done to them to cause them to grow something like 65 times faster than the normal rate of a chicken for the meat industry, so that they're so heavy and growing so rapidly, their skeletal system can't even hold up their body weight. Those people who are raising these so-called alternative non-factory farm birds are getting them from factory farm hatcheries. They're ordering them from these huge Midwestern factories like McMurray and the others who are just like McMurray. And so they're buying birds who have been bred for industrial farming purposes, and they are having them transported, not exactly locavourishly, to their local habitat, their own local region or homestead or whatever, and then calling this an alternative to factory farming. What we also see is that the attitudes, as displayed on websites, towards the animals who are being raised on these so-called alternative farms and in these backyard homesteads are treated with the same disdain, the same contempt as standard factory farm animals are treated by in these huge industries. So really, family farming and alternative so-called humane farming is really an extension of factory farming. And the thing is that factory farming behaviors and attitudes towards animals, towards chickens and turkeys and pigs and other animals raised for food, grew out of attitudes and behaviors that were part and parcel of family farming and small farming. So there really is no distinction to be made there in reality. Many people think that industrial farming was developed by these corporate entrepreneurs who forced industrial farming on small farmers, and don't understand that it was regular small farmers who developed factory farming. For example, Tyson in Arkansas, in Springdale, Arkansas, is one of the architects of modern chicken farming, and they were just regular farmers who began to cash in on the Depression and to start sending chickens to Chicago during the Depression. But before that, they mainly raised produce. And down where we're located on the eastern shore of Virginia, well, in Maryland, about an hour north of us, in Salisbury, Maryland, Purdue, Frank Perdue's father was just an ordinary chicken and egg farmer. So he developed what became one of the largest chicken factory farms on the planet. And then you have practices like debeaking, which is a horribly painful mutilation of a bird's sensitive beak in order to cut down on the type of pecking that results from frustration and being unable to forage in confined chickens and turkeys. This wasn't developed by in some corporate board meeting. Debeaking was developed by farmers in San Diego who would use soldering irons and even pocket knives and toenail clippers. So when you learn about the roots of factory farming, you see that there wasn't this sudden break between this benign farming that then was overtaken by this evil factory farming. Family farming developed into factory farming. And now we have what is being falsely represented as a humane alternative to factory farming of animals, which really is using the same kinds of breeding, has the same kinds of attitudes, the same idea that you want to maximize your output and minimize your input. Cutting corners, doing virtually every hen, for example, who is purchased by a small farmer, a backyard farmer, comes in the mail because they're shipped through them by airplane as like cans of canned goods and luggage, that they come already debeaked because they debeak them automatically in the hatcheries. You see all kinds of mutilations of animals in these alternative farm scenes. You see women who say that they find themselves, as they are getting more into this farming mentality, that their attitudes, they will even confess that their attitudes towards their animals is becoming more like what they started out being opposed to. That it just comes with the territory. And part of it is when you have a set of beings who are completely at your mercy, who have no real protections, and you really have total control over their bodies, and you only bring them into the world to do something with their bodies. It's really a culture of violence. And it just sort of escalates into more violence and more comfort with a violent attitude toward whoever those beings may be. We've seen this in human slavery. We certainly see it in animal slavery. So the whole idea of humane slaughter is a myth, because just like human beings, for example, the throat, the trachea, that entire area of the neck that a knife slices across, that's a very, very sensitive part of the body. And no one wants to have a knife beside their face. No one. And we as humans, when we hear about somebody having their throats cut, whether it's a home invasion or a husband gets mad at his wife and cuts her throat, or some kind of a war crime type of throat cutting, we consider that to be a horrible kind of cruelty, justifiably. Because it's painful, it's terrifying, it involves choking to death in your own blood, and anything that is done right next to somebody's face that is dangerous and destructive and painful rightly causes us to feel a visceral revulsion. And yet we will calmly talk about things like humane slaughter when it comes to other animals, and yet they are neurophysiologically, whether they're pigs or chickens or turkeys or cows, they have the same neurophysiological apparatus as we do. They have the same pain receptors, nociceptors as they're called. They have the same impact receptors. They feel the impact of different types of objects against their skin. They have the same thermoreceptors, which means that they register, as we do, the temperature of objects to which their body comes into contact. So while we immediately feel revulsion at the idea of a human being having his or her throat cut, we sort of talk blandly about humanely cutting the throat of a chicken or a pig or a dog. Well, not so much a dog in our culture, but in some other cultures, that's considered okay, just like slaughtering a pig in our culture. So what we find is that there's really no such thing as a humane alternative to factory farming. That the one thing distinguishing factory farming that is, of course, also included in many of these alternative farms is antibiotic use. Because when you are raising animals in a crowded condition, when they are stressed, when they are not allowed to have access to their normal activities and normal outdoor life, and they're experiencing unnatural chronic stress, that leads them to have weakened immune systems. That means that they are more susceptible to a wide range of diseases. You add that to breeding for particular biological food-based traits, and you have a use of antibiotics. That's the one thing that distinguishes modern animal farming of any kind from previous farming, that and the scale of production. Those are the two main changes. And the fact that virtually all animals, regardless of how they're being raised, except on very, very small operations, are living their entire lives indoors. And again, we need to think about the fact that it might be natural for us to spend a lot of our time indoors, maybe most of our time, at least in our society. But for these animals, spending their lives indoors isn't natural at all. And so I don't think we really understand what it feels like for them to not only be living, forced to live against their will, entirely out indoors without any access to grass or fresh air or anything, but to be living in a totally polluted environment, because when you crowd animals indoors and they don't have access to fresh air, again, their immune systems suffer, they're susceptible to diseases, they're living in their own excrement, they're miserable, and yet these kinds of conditions can be sold as humane alternatives. And recently, there was an investigation in California of one of Whole Foods' major suppliers of eggs, where they have labels about how our hens are humanely treated, and the conditions in which these hens were being kept, along with roosters, because they were selling fertilized eggs, it's all over the internet. It's horrible. It's no different. It is no different. The dirt, the filth, the misery, the defeathered condition of the birds. These are birds who are supposed to be raised as humanely raised eggs. Of course, you can't really raise eggs. You can only raise hens. Humanely raised eggs for Whole Foods. And of course, people who go to Whole Foods and buy these eggs, they're paying like 3 times as much because they want to believe that the eggs, and they're being lied to, that the hens whose eggs cost 3 times as much were treated humanely.